Tell me, do you feel lucky, rebel scum? Well, do ya? Do ya? Greetings, fellow makers. I'm Bill Duran down here in the shop, and I made Rey's blaster from the new Star Wars movie, The Force Awakens. Just like, well, just about everyone else on the planet, I really enjoyed the new Star Wars movie, and of course I wanted to make something from it. Now, it's no secret that I'm a big fan of space guns, so Rey's LPANN-14 blaster pistol seemed like the obvious choice. And of course, I'm gonna show you exactly how I did it. But first, I really want to inspire you guys to try and make one of these too. So to help you along the way, I made a free set of blueprints that you can download. There will be a link down in the description. Go grab those, print them out, and give it a try. And secondly, most of my job was done using my 3D printer. That doesn't mean you need a 3D printer to do it yourself. You can use a whole bunch of different mediums and techniques to try it out. I have a video on making space guns from MDF. You can check that out. And I also have a really good one on making guns from EVA foam. So don't let the limitations get you down. This can be done for an extremely cheap price with a variety of techniques. All right, let's get cracking on the build. After gathering reference images from Google image search and the replica prop forum, I got to 3D modeling all of my parts. Now, most of these pieces were done up in 123D Design, a free and easy CAD tool from Autodesk. I modeled the gun in several pieces specifically designed for 3D printing and mold making, and for the less geometric pieces, like these grips on the side of the gun, I used Maya and some good old-fashioned polygon modeling. Some parts were left out intentionally, specifically all the screws. It makes way more sense to just source all of the real hardware than to model and print out any tiny details like that would need to be cleaned up later. The files were prepped and printed out using my Dremel Idea Builder in a PLA plastic. This took several tries to get some of the pieces just right, but that's exactly what 3D printing is good at, rapid prototyping. For example, the grips, it took me 3 tries to get them right. Then all of these 3D printed pieces were sanded down smooth with a 220 grit sandpaper by hand. Whee! When I was happy with the finish, everything was hit with some really nice filler primer to help remove any remaining 3D printer texture. Then it was all sanded. Again. And once I was happy with that, I did one more final pass with a normal primer and some wet sanding to get the surface all pretty for mold making. Before I poured all of the liquid rubber goo, I went in and added all of the real screws. I simply drilled out some holes for them with the drill press and then screwed them in using a little bit of super glue to make sure they wouldn't try to escape. The trigger was a pretty simple little shape, so I made that on my laser cutter using a piece of acrylic plastic. I had to modify the handle a little bit, both to adjust the thickness because I had 3D modeled it just a little too wide, but also to accommodate the trigger. Now I wanted these pieces to be cast separately, so I used a Bondo squish method to make a cavity for the trigger to live in once these pieces were cast. The print direction on some of the gun pieces didn't leave me confident that the circular details would have remained perfectly circular, so I widened them out with a drill press. Since this punched into the infill on the prints, I had to go back with some epoxy sculpt to fill and clean up the work. Once it cured, I was able to sand it all smooth. Now, finally, these pieces were ready for mold making. The parts needed sprues added to them for pouring spouts, so I glued all of those on there, and then I set about planning the silicone molds. Most of these parts were made using very simple 1-part molds, although the main body and the handle required slightly more complicated 2-part molds. Of course, we just finished an entire series on mold making that's worth checking out, with a couple of videos specifically devoted to 1- and 2-part molds. There will be links down below. The pieces were prepped, silicone was poured and cured, and then the parts were liberated. Piece of cake, right? All the parts were cast using a urethane plastic resin. These were all very simple dump molds, so I just mixed up some resin with a little bit of tint, and then I poured them into their respective molds and waited for them to cure. The grips were done in a slightly different way. I used a resin that cures jet black, thus negating the need to paint these parts later. When they were cured and pulled from the mold, I sanded off the sprues and then wet sanded the surface. I took them to a 1200 grit wet sand and then I polished them up with some plastic polish. Finally, I added a couple of real screws to complete the grips. The remaining parts of my space gun came out of the molds a nice gray color. The sprues were trimmed off and sanded down, and some of the pieces had seam lines that needed to be sanded smooth. When I was totally happy with the surfaces, the last thing I had to do before painting was to add some holes and slots for assembly. For the cylindrical parts like the barrel, I made a couple of jigs out of MDF to hold the parts while I drilled the assembly holes. These jigs were clamped together and I used the drill press to make the holes. The slot in the back of the main body was a little bit trickier. Again, I clamped it into the drill press, but I had to make several holes to start the shape for the assembly slot. This slot was then cleaned up a little bit with a chisel and a rotary tool, just enough so that the handle part would fit nice and snug. Then finally, I could paint the space gun. Everything was hit with a little bit of primer and then base coated with a glossy black lacquer. After several coats of black, I hit everything with some gloss clear to make sure I had a nice shiny base for my metallic paints. When that was dry, I applied the polished aluminum lacquer, achieving a nice shiny metallic finish. This finish was sealed with that gloss clear to protect it, and when it was dry, I could finally put the gun all together. The parts were glued up using a 5-minute epoxy. This gave me a little time to snug all the parts together and make sure that they were lined up correctly. The grips, on the other hand, were glued down using super glue. The last touch to bring this piece to life was to add a little bit of weathering. The end of the gun had a little bit of bluing going on, so I touched it up with a little bit of transparent blue lacquer. The rest of it was heat scorched, so I went back in with an airbrush and some flat black acrylic paint to char it up a bit. The rest of the gun just needed to look grimy and dirty, so I busted out my favorite oil paints to weather it out a whole bunch. Mostly using black and brown paints, I smeared on lots of the goo in all of the nooks and crannies, and then I used a paper towel to wipe most of it away. I repeated this process over the entire gun. This left the metal finish looking really greasy, adding that last bit of realism to our space gun. Ta-da! Ray's blaster is finally done and I am pretty stoked about it. I really do hope you guys try and make your own. Like I said, I have a free blueprint file in the description down below. It's got one big view of the entire gun and then a couple more pages that are formatted to print out on a letter size printer at the correct scale. And before you ask, no, I won't be selling any of these, either unpainted kits or finished ones. I really want you guys to go out and try and make one for yourselves. Hence the free blueprints. Also, the 3D files I have for this are kind of a mess. I'm not going to be giving those out either, but we have our prop 3D video series out there that should help you guys learn some of the basic modeling techniques I use for this. So go watch those. The software is free, the blueprints are out there. You can totally do this start to finish. You got it, I believe in you. This is a really fun project. I hope you try it out, and if you do, then of course I wanna see what you've come up with. You can let me know over on Twitter, that's at Chinbeard. And of course, if you have questions about this build in particular, you can leave them in the comments of this video down below. Thank you guys so much for checking out our videos. If you're new to the channel, of course, you're gonna wanna subscribe. We have new prop and costume making videos out every single week just for you guys. We also have some more space gun building videos for you. We've done a whole bunch of those. Some really great start to finish builds, so go check those out as well. Finally, I really hope you guys learned a bunch from this build. I know I learned a lot making it. Now, if you've gleaned some helpful value from all of these videos that we make, then please consider throwing a little bit of that value back our way. Whether that's in the form of sharing all of our videos, which is super duper helpful, or in the form of supporting our Patreon campaign, which is linked down below. Both of those methods help our channel in so many ways. It helps us grow, it helps us make better videos, it helps us make more videos, so please consider helping out. Thanks so much for checking out the video. I'll see you guys next time, and what are you waiting for? Go out there and make a space gun.